There is a moment right before something ends when the body knows before the mind does. You felt it, that strange tightness in your chest that has no explanation, that sudden urge to check your phone for no reason at all, that flicker of a memory that arrives uninvited at 2 a.m. when you least expect it. You tell yourself it's nothing, but here's the truth. It's never nothing, because somewhere, right now, someone is thinking about you in a way they haven't let themselves think in months. And the distance between you two, the silence, the waiting, the ache, is about to collapse in on itself. This is not a prediction. This is psychology. This is the architecture of the subconscious mind and what it does when two people are bound by something deeper than proximity. Sit with that for a second, because what you're about to hear will make you deeply uncomfortable, and that discomfort is the proof that it's true. Let's start with the brutal part, the part nobody wants to admit. You have spent months, maybe years, convincing yourself that distance was the enemy, that the miles between you and them were the reason it hurt, that if only they were closer, if only the ocean or the highway or the time zones disappeared, everything would resolve itself. But that was never the real wound. The real wound was the silence, the unanswered questions, the nights you replayed conversations searching for a hidden meaning that wasn't there, or worse, one that was, and you were too afraid to name it. And this is where it gets dangerous, because the mind does something cruel when it's starved of closure. It builds a story. It fills in the blanks with fear instead of fact. It tells you they've moved on, that the connection meant more to you than it did to them, that you were foolish for holding on this long. That story feels true. It feels like protection, but it's not protection. It's repression in disguise. Freud called this the defense mechanism of the ego, the mind's desperate attempt to shield itself from pain by rewriting reality into something more bearable. If you convince yourself they don't feel it too, then their silence doesn't hurt as much. If you convince yourself the bond was one-sided, you don't have to sit with the terrifying possibility that it wasn't, that they've simply been drowning in the same silence you have, unable to reach across it. Most people don't see this. They mistake self-protection for self-awareness. They think the walls they've built are wisdom. But walls don't come from wisdom. Walls come from wounds. And here's what they never admit, even to themselves. The loneliest part of long distance isn't the missing, it's the doubting. It's lying awake wondering if you're the only one still holding on, while some quiet, buried part of you already knows the answer. You are not the only one. Let that sink in, because I want you to feel the weight of it before we go further. Somewhere in a life you can't see and a mind you can't access, they have been fighting their own war, not with distance, with themselves. Because the truth about soulmate connections, and yes, I use that word carefully, because it's not about fantasy, it's about resonance, about two nervous systems that regulate each other in a way strangers never could. The truth is that these connections don't dissolve just because two bodies are far apart. They intensify. That's the part almost nobody understands. Physical distance doesn't weaken a real psychological bond. It amplifies it because the subconscious mind doesn't run on logic or geography. It runs on unresolved emotional patterns. And an unresolved bond is like an open wound the psyche keeps circling back to again and again, in dreams, in intrusive thoughts, in random moments of unexplainable longing. That's when the mind betrays them. Picture it. Picture the version of them that goes through the motions of daily life, work, friends, distractions, while some deeper, older part of their psyche keeps whispering your name in the background. Not loudly, not obviously, but persistently. The way a smell can bring back a memory you didn't consciously choose to remember. They've tried to bury it. Of course they have. Burying pain is the oldest trick the human mind knows. But repression has a shelf life. Carl Jung wrote about the shadow self, the parts of us we refuse to look at, the desires and fears we push into the unconscious because facing them feels too dangerous. And here's the uncomfortable truth. When someone represses their feelings for another person, those feelings don't disappear. They go underground, they wait, and eventually they resurface, often at the exact moment the person least expects it, in a form so intense it feels involuntary. That is what's happening right now. Somewhere, the walls they built to survive the distance are starting to crack, not because of some outside event, but because the psyche cannot sustain repression forever. Eventually, the shadow demands to be seen. And this is where it gets dangerous, because when repressed longing finally breaks through, it doesn't arrive gently. It arrives as urgency, as a sudden, overwhelming need to reach out, to close the gap, to stop pretending the distance was ever really about miles. You might be feeling that right now too, that restlessness, that inability to fully commit your attention to anything else, that sense that something is shifting, even though nothing on the surface has changed. That's not coincidence. That's resonance. Psychologists call it limbic resonance, the phenomenon where two nervous systems, once deeply attuned to each other, keep synchronizing even across distance. It's why you can feel someone's energy shift before they say a single word. It's why you've had the eerie experience of thinking about them intensely, only to have them reach out minutes later. Most people dismiss this as coincidence because acknowledging it means admitting something they can't fully control, and the ego hates what it can't control. But here's the truth. You were never imagining it. Now, let's go deeper, because there's a layer to this most people never reach, the layer where the real transformation happens. When two people are separated by distance, there is always a temptation to read that separation as rejection. This is one of the mind's oldest and cruelest tricks. It confuses absence with abandonment, but absence is not abandonment. Sometimes absence is exactly what someone needs in order to finally face themselves. Here's what I mean. Some people cannot access their own emotional truth, while the object of that truth is standing in front of them. Proximity creates noise, distraction, comfort, the illusion of stability. It's only in distance, in silence, in the ache of missing someone, that a person is forced to confront what they actually feel, stripped of every convenient distraction. This is uncomfortable to hear, I know, because it means the distance that hurt you so deeply may have been the exact mechanism they needed to finally understand what you meant to them. And that silence changes everything. Because silence is not empty. Silence is data. Silence is the sound of someone processing something too big to say out loud yet. Think about the moments in your life when you went quiet, not because you didn't care, but because you cared too much to trust your own words. That is often what silence really is, not indifference, overwhelm. The version of them that's been quiet, distant, hard to read, that version has likely been fighting an internal war between fear and desire. Fear of vulnerability, fear of being hurt again, fear of wanting something so badly that losing it would be unbearable, and desire, the relentless, inconvenient desire to be near you again, to stop performing independence, to admit that happiness without you has felt incomplete, no matter how good life looks from the outside. This is the internal contradiction almost nobody talks about. A person can be functioning perfectly well, succeeding at work, laughing with friends, appearing entirely fine, while quietly carrying an unresolved emotional wound they refuse to name. Freud called this the split between the conscious and unconscious self. On the surface, everything looks composed. Underneath, an entirely different story is playing out, one of longing, guilt, and unfinished business. What they never admit is that moving on and healing are not the same thing. Many people mistake distraction for closure. They fill the space where you used to be with routines, other relationships, achievements, anything to avoid facing the fact that none of it quiets the ache the way your presence did. This is where the psychological pressure builds, because eventually distraction stops working. The mind can only outrun an unresolved emotional truth for so long before exhaustion sets in. And in that exhaustion, clarity finally arrives. That clarity often looks like this: a quiet, undeniable realization that happiness was never really about proving independence. It was never about becoming someone new, someone unattached, someone who didn't need connection to feel whole. It was about coming back to the one connection that never fully left, no matter how much distance tried to erase it. Let's go even deeper, because I want you to understand exactly what happens in the mind of someone who is finally ready to come home, emotionally and physically. There is a psychological idea called cognitive dissonance, the discomfort a person feels when their beliefs and their actions don't line up. For a long time, the version of them living apart from you has likely been caught in exactly this kind of dissonance. Part of them believed that staying distant was safer, that protecting themselves meant keeping you at arm's length, even while missing you. That independence was proof of strength. But another part of them, the part they tried to silence, knew that safety without connection isn't really safety at all. It's just a slower, quieter kind of loneliness. Holding two contradictory truths at once creates unbearable inner tension, and the mind cannot sustain that tension forever. Eventually, something has to give. That's when the mind betrays them, because the moment the dissonance becomes too loud to ignore, action becomes inevitable. The walls come down, not because circumstances changed, but because the psychological cost of holding up those walls became greater than the fear of vulnerability itself. This is the exact tipping point many people reach right before reconciliation. It rarely looks dramatic from the outside. It often looks like a simple decision to finally answer honestly, to finally admit what they've been avoiding, to finally stop performing okayness and start telling the truth. But internally, it's anything but simple. Internally, it's the collapse of months, maybe years, of carefully built defense mechanisms. And here's the part that will unsettle you the most. They've likely already started imagining what it would feel like to see you again, not in a vague, hypothetical way, in vivid, specific detail. The sound of your voice, the exact way you'd react, the words they'd want to say first. The subconscious mind rehearses reunions long before the conscious mind admits it wants one. This is not wishful thinking. This is how the psyche prepares for emotionally significant events. It runs simulations, it tests scenarios, it softens the fear by imagining the outcome enough times that the real thing feels less terrifying when it finally happens. If you've noticed a shift lately, a message that came a little sooner than expected, a tone that felt warmer, a silence that broke without explanation, that is not random. That is the visible edge of an invisible process that has been building for a long time. Most people miss this because they're looking for grand gestures. They're waiting for a dramatic declaration, a cinematic moment of return. But real psychological shifts rarely happen that way. They happen quietly first, in private thoughts, in small hesitations, in the moment someone almost reaches out and then doesn't, 3 times, before finally doing it on the 4th. You may be standing exactly at that threshold right now, without even realizing it. Let's talk about fear, because fear is the final gatekeeper standing between distance and reunion. The deepest fear in any meaningful connection is not losing the other person. It's losing yourself in the process of wanting them. It's the terror of realizing how much power someone else's presence or absence has over your emotional state. This is why some people push love away, even when they want it desperately. Not because they don't feel it, but because feeling it that intensely feels dangerous. It threatens the illusion of control the ego works so hard to hold on to. But here's the truth. Control was never real to begin with, not in love, not in a connection this deep. The moment 2 people form a genuine psychological bond, a part of their nervous systems becomes linked, whether they consciously choose it or not. That's not romantic exaggeration. That's neuroscience, co-regulation, emotional attunement, the body responding to another person's presence, tone, and energy in ways the conscious mind can't fully override. Fighting that connection doesn't dissolve it. It only creates inner conflict, the exhausting circular battle between wanting closeness and fearing what closeness demands. And that inner conflict has a cost. It shows up as restlessness, as dissatisfaction with things that used to feel fulfilling, as an unshakable sense that something or someone is missing, even when life looks complete on paper. This is the emotional result of unresolved subconscious patterns, a steady, low-grade unease that no amount of success, distraction, or new experience can fully quiet. If they've been distant, It's likely because distance felt like the only way to manage that unease. But avoidance is never a permanent solution. It's a delay, and delays always come due. Now, here is where the psychological pressure reaches its peak, the moment right before transformation. There is a stage in every unresolved emotional bond where avoidance becomes more painful than confrontation, where continuing to pretend costs more than finally telling the truth, where the fear of staying apart outweighs the fear of coming back together. This is the collapse point. It's the moment illusions stop working. The story that this is fine, that distance doesn't matter, that moving on is the healthier choice. All of it starts to crumble under the weight of what the body and mind actually feel. And when illusions collapse, something remarkable happens. Clarity arrives, sudden and undeniable. That clarity often sounds like this internally. I don't want to keep pretending. This doesn't matter to me. I don't want to keep performing indifference. I want to stop protecting myself from something that was never actually dangerous. It was just real. And real things are terrifying because they demand honesty. This is the psychological climax of the entire process, the moment someone stops managing their feelings and starts acting on them. And it rarely stays hidden for long once it arrives, because once clarity replaces avoidance, the pull to close the distance physically, emotionally, completely becomes almost impossible to hold back. That's the shift happening right now, in real time, in a mind that has spent far too long convincing itself that distance was sustainable. It wasn't. It never was. It was just tolerated, because tolerance felt safer than hope. But hope has a way of resurfacing exactly when it's least expected, and exactly when it's most needed. Let's be honest about something most people avoid saying out loud. Soulmate connections aren't comfortable. They aren't easy. They demand a level of vulnerability most relationships never require, because they bypass the surface entirely and go straight for the parts of you that are usually hidden even from yourself. That's why distance in a connection like this feels so much more brutal than ordinary distance. It's not just missing a person, it's missing the version of yourself that only existed in their presence, the safest, most understood, most fully seen version of you. And here's what they never admit. Losing access to that version of themselves has been just as painful for them as it has been for you. Because when someone truly sees you, not the performance, not the curated version, but the real, unfiltered you, walking away from that doesn't just cost the relationship, it costs a part of their own identity. That's why so many people who create distance in soulmate connections eventually find their way back. Not because circumstances force them to, but because staying away from the one place they felt fully known becomes unbearable. You are not chasing someone who doesn't want to be caught. You are standing at the other end of a bond that has been quietly, invisibly pulling itself back together this whole time, through every silence, every doubt, every moment you almost gave up. Most people don't see this because it doesn't look like anything on the surface. It looks like nothing is happening, but underneath, everything has been happening, restructuring, healing, preparing. Psychological transformation is never loud in its early stages. It's slow, it's internal, it's invisible until suddenly it isn't. And that's exactly where this is heading. Here is the final uncomfortable truth I need you to sit with. You cannot force this. You cannot rush a psyche through its own necessary unraveling. Every attempt to control the timeline of someone else's emotional reckoning only delays it further, because it reintroduces the very pressure that made distance feel necessary in the first place. The only thing required of you right now is patience laced with self-respect, the willingness to hold space for what's coming without abandoning yourself in the waiting. Because here's what almost nobody tells you: the way you handle this waiting period will shape the quality of what comes after it. If you spend it in anxious pursuit, chasing reassurance, forcing contact, you interrupt the very process that's working in your favor. But if you spend it in quiet self-trust, doing your own healing, becoming more fully yourself, not performing for an outcome, but simply living, you become someone even more magnetic to return to. This is not about manipulation. This is about psychological truth. People are drawn back not to who they left, but to who that person has become in their absence. So if you've felt the pull to grow lately, to focus on yourself, to stop obsessively checking for signs, to build a life that feels good regardless of the outcome, trust that instinct. It's not distraction, it's preparation. Because the reunion that's coming isn't going to be a return to what was. It's going to be the beginning of something neither of you were ready for the first time around, something built on the honesty that distance forced both of you to finally reach. And that's when the mind betrays them one final time in the best possible way, when avoidance gives way to admission, when fear gives way to action, when the walls that felt so necessary finally reveal themselves as unnecessary all along. You felt the shift. You felt the strange, unexplainable lightness underneath the ache. You felt the moments where hope crept back in, even when you tried to talk yourself out of it. That's not naivety. That's your own subconscious picking up on something your conscious mind hasn't fully let itself believe yet. But here's the truth. You don't have to force yourself to believe it right now. You just have to stop actively fighting it. Because somewhere, the distance is already closing. Not because of magic, not because of coincidence, but because two nervous systems that were never meant to stay disconnected are finally doing what they've been quietly working toward this whole time. Coming back into alignment, coming back into truth, coming home.